Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone tuning in today to our December installation in our latest InterReach series on evaluation. And I first would like to thank everyone for being here. I'm Amalia Turner, and I'm here with my InterReach co-chairs, Christine Glover and Christine Hendren. And we're all so grateful to see so many people here who are interested in this field of interdisciplinary integration. And we hope that there will be some great discussion that will come out of today's presentation by Marisa Rinkus. So Dr. Marisa Rinkus is an associate director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative Center at Michigan State University. Her work involves studying and facilitating dialogue that supports the cultivation of cross-disciplinary collaborative practice. Through this work, she's led team science research and client-based projects for the National Science Foundation and multiple universities in the US. She's published on this work in the book, The Toolbox Dialogue Initiatives, The Power of Cross-Disciplinary Practice, and recent book chapters, Communication as Practice for Team Science and Addressing Perspectives with the Toolbox Dialogue Method, as well as in multiple journal articles. At the core of all her work is the aim to help groups create more collaborative and inclusive engagement. So Marisa is here to talk to us about unpacking convergence culture, exploring the operationalization of convergence in teams. So I'm going to welcome Marisa to say hello and start sharing her screen, and we will take questions in the chat, and at the end of Marisa's talk, we hope for some lively discussion.
Excellent, thank you. Introduction. So being asked to be part of this session on evaluation, I thought, I don't know how to evaluate convergence. We're trying to figure out what we're measuring, and in order to figure out what we're measuring, we need to know what it is. But this is some of our pilot project I'm going to present on today. So first, I want to start by acknowledging the National Science Foundation for our award through the Growing Convergence Research Program, and my co-PIs, Dr. Mark LaRourke and Dr. Chet McCluskey, who are also on here today, and research assistants AY Odedei and Jaime Garcia Vila. So AY is on here as well for their efforts in analyzing the data, especially cleaning and coding our interview transcripts. And finally, of course, the PIs and co-PIs and project members from the various GCR-funded projects for their participation in interviews and our survey. So I want to start out with a question for all of you in the chat, just out of my own curiosity. Do you think convergence is a process, an outcome, or both? So or something else, and put that in the chat, please. Yeah, so Michael and Chet and I had lots of discussions about convergence and what we were affectionately calling the Superman problem, right? Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Is it something else? So this is, in thinking about that, through the reading of the convergence literature, much of which comes from Bainbridge and Rocco, these two statements stuck out to me in particular based on my interests, right? Particularly this idea of escalating and transformative interactions among seemingly different disciplines, technologies, and communities to achieve mutual compatibility, synergy, and integration, and thus to create added value to meet shared goals. And however, there's this comment, it's best facilitated by a holistic approach using shared methodologies, theories, and goals. However, as we all know, there's little else written sort of about how it's done and what it looks like, which really led to this project of thinking about the conceptualization and operationalization of convergence from the perspective of the teams themselves who are in the process of doing it. So this project focuses on the National Science Foundation's Growing Convergence Research Program, which defines convergence as having two primary characteristics, research driven by a specific and compelling problem, and deep integration across disciplines. But beyond that, the GCR program places emphasis on developing what they call as a convergence culture. So in the RFP, it notes proposers should articulate how they will intentionally bring together their research team and develop a convergent culture of discovery and communication. Proposals should specifically address the strategies that will be implemented to organize collaboration among project participants, promote team effectiveness, and advance convergent science processes and outcomes. All project participants should recognize that readiness to engage in extensive interactions and conceptual and methodological integration is essential for the success of the project, and new training and learning experiences for participants at all levels, most importantly postdocs and graduate students, is also an essential component of a convergence culture. So it notes that convergence culture is a critical component of the project success and likely a condition for receiving funding and continued funding, since the GCR program is a two-phase funding mechanism where projects are funded in phase 1 for 2 years and then can apply for continued funding. However, the original proposal is to be written for the full grant. So since there's this general consensus that in convergence involves integration and even deep integration, one way to look at this concept of convergence culture as described by NSF is within these 3 categories of integration: knowledge integration, methodological integration, and social integration, in thinking to this description that they have in the RFP. So knowledge integration involving the integration of disciplinary, professional, and experiential conceptual knowledge; methodological integration involving the integration of methods, technology, tools, and approaches; and social integration representing the relationship building and what I think of as, involving the teaming aspects. So I want to take a quick step back just to define culture. Culture is defined in a lot of ways. It's part of our everyday lives, but culture in the context of research teams can really be defined as the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution or an organization. So the behavior, attitudes, beliefs, norms, and language are all important aspects of culture for a team, as we all know. And all of these are embedded within the knowledge, methodological, and social integration categories there. Because I couldn't resist a Venn diagram, because it just seemed too perfect right here. It made me think, if these 3 aspects make up this convergence culture, what is at the center? Is just convergence culture as the center? Is convergence culture on the outside? Or does these 3 categories help to create these aspects help to create the conditions for deep integration? That's a question I'm sure my co-investigators are grumbling about in the background right now. We'll discuss later. So for our research had 2 guiding questions for our pilot study. One is, how are GCR funded teams conceptualizing convergence research, and how are they operationalizing it? So the study involved members of NSF funded Growing Convergence Research project teams, primarily principal investigators and co-principal investigators from both the phase 1 and phase 2 teams of the first 4 cohorts of the funded projects from 2019 to 2023. Our work also involves conducting dialogues with the teams, and we've been doing that since 2020, but the 2019 cohort. So we worked with 37 teams over that time. And then this project focus, what I'll talk about today, focuses on the interviews, which I conducted 20 interviews in the fall of 2023, and surveys in spring of 2024. So very small sample of surveys went out to a little bit less than 200 people, about 173 PIs and co-PIs. And the interviews focused primarily on, I had half representation from phase 2 funded teams, mainly from the first 2 cohorts. And we focused that on those areas because those teams have spent the most time working in a convergence research project and therefore have more experience to speak from. Overall, there was representation from 11 funded project teams in the surveys. 7 of which were phase 2 funded. 3 were not phase 2 funded projects. Either they did not apply or they did not receive the award, and 1 phase 1 team that was in the process of applying for it. The survey participants really represented equal number of responses across all of the cohorts and represents really, as I mentioned, a small sample from the 173. All right, just looking at the chat there. The interviews had 11 questions across these 4 areas. So how do you see your project as convergence research? What is your team doing to create the conditions for convergence? So are they facilitating the processes or practices or tools that they're using? How are you measuring convergence in your project, and what does a convergence team need to have and do to be successful? I'll focus primarily on the top 2 questions, but I'll touch briefly on the other 2 as well, since the first 2 are more exciting. For the survey, the conceptualization and operationalization questions were developed from the interview data, and I'll include that in today's presentation. The assessment of the collaborative processes and attitudes towards convergence research were items that were adapted from the transdisciplinary collaboration scale developed by Massey and colleagues, with the language adapted when necessary to refer to convergence research. So replacing transdisciplinarity or transdisciplinary research with convergence. And then there were sections on individual characteristics included from the intellectual humility scale and epistemic curiosity. And these 2 constructs were chosen based on the information collected through the interviews and the toolbox workshops that indicated these were individual characteristics that were important for individuals to possess when engaging in convergence research. And we don't have a lot of data to talk about those, but I wanted to mention them, so maybe we can have a discussion if others are interested in measuring these as well later. So how did teams conceptualize convergence? Well, from the interviews, what I learned is that participants are still really working out how to describe what is happening through the convergence research process. Some struggled more than others really in finding the language and the right words to use to talk about convergence, many relying on the language used by the National Science Foundation, some describing it in terms of what it isn't, so not multidisciplinary or more than interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, or simply different from previous experiences. Some of those who were unsuccessful in securing phase 2 funding felt it was just a meaningless buzzword and it was not different than anything they had done before, which is another interesting side project to go on there. But really, they talked about it as an approach addressing a real-world problem that included deep collaboration. And they talked a lot about what was needed for, right? Requiring deliberate planning and effort at every stage to allow unique collaboration structures and techniques between academic disciplines. It was also described really as an emergent project, property of the project. So this idea that it's more than the sum of its parts, and also just a way of understanding a collaborative project. So it's described in a lot of different ways. This just is a quote that illustrates how people were kind of grappling with this language, right? So to me, convergence is more than just multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary research. It involves projects that not only crowd across disciplines and work together, but start to develop new disciplines and new bridges across disciplines that didn't exist before. So this uses a lot of NSF language about creating new disciplines or bridging across new disciplines, creating new subfields of knowledge, or is on the verge of creating new subfields of knowledge. I think the time component here is really important to think about. These teams are in the process, so they haven't reached this creating this new subfield of knowledge yet, or they don't feel that they've obviously created a new discipline in a short time frame. And looking at the responses to the survey, we took some of these ideas from the definitions at NSF and from the interview responses and created them into survey questions. And a majority of people felt that, right, it does involve deep integration of knowledge across multiple disciplines. It should have a societal impact. It may be involved in the creation of new methodologies, maybe for some teams more than others, or the creation of new fields of study, or the creation of new theories. And then also other aspects that were brought up in the other category were technology or product development and engagement with stakeholders across sectors. furthermore, in thinking about how do teams operationalize convergence, if we're looking at the knowledge integration aspect, this was really discussed in terms of building a shared understanding. And some of the key points that came up for groups about building a shared understanding were inquiring about what a concept or term meant, with questioning going beyond meaning and focusing on understanding. And I think this is a really key point. So going beyond meaning, going beyond definitions, and really focusing on a deeper level of understanding is what a lot of these groups were talking about. Also demonstrating a willingness to learn and use each other's disciplinary language. So I think this is a higher level. It's one thing to learn the language of another discipline, but actually use it is another thing. So people were talking about the fact that they would give presentations at conferences outside of their discipline, right? And so if you're at a conference presenting at a conference that's not in your discipline, are you able to use and explain your project to these people in another discipline in a way that they understand it and you also understand it? So this use of each other's language. And then listening with respect, acknowledging that each perspective adds to gaining a more comprehensive understanding of the scientific problem. And this, I thought this was an interesting way to think about it. So this PI said, it feels like the mandate of convergence is look for your questions at the intersection of everyone's questions. Look for your questions in the language that emerges when you try to understand each other. So again, getting beyond this meaning of definitions of words, really trying to understand and then developing these new questions from that language. So again, in the survey, I took some of these responses of what the teams were saying that they were doing and trying to understand if, that was unique to some of these phase 2 funded teams, or was it more broadly applied? So as part of the research convergence project, have they read from publications outside of their discipline? Have they contributed to publications outside of discipline? Those are obviously very heavily utilized tools. Supervise students outside of your area of expertise or discipline. So this was something that came up in a couple of the interviews that the PIs and co-PIs felt was really important, was supervising students outside of your discipline. And then presenting at conferences outside our discipline or area of expertise. So in looking at building this shared language, it was discussed as cultivating shared language as a neutral space or a new territory from which questions have emerged. So similar to the previous quote, but also using a particular methodology. This group talked about their methodology of spiraling. So this idea of talking about the same subject. In some ways, they joked about it, right? We talk about it over and over again until we're tired of talking about it or something happens. So the process of we keep talking about an issue until either somebody gives up or we come up with something that is of interest to all of us in this new space. So creating this new space or neutral territory that is outside of everyone's discipline that kind of helps to create that comfort level and that curiosity for further understanding. In looking at methodological integration, a lot of the teams talked about involving a project member in every step of the process from planning to testing, and being intentional about who collaborates with whom. So some groups were even, keeping an Excel file to be like, okay, this person they haven't written a paper with this person or done a presentation with them. And being intentional about making that happen or putting them on projects together. Cross-checking findings with team members across disciplines, acknowledging the shortcomings of each discipline's scientific methods, and creating a framework that leverages the strengths across disciplines. So many teams talked about, being willing and open to acknowledge the shortcomings of your own disciplinary method and then working together to create that framework. And then experience applying a method from another discipline. So one interesting example is engineers and medical professionals working together where they had engineering students actually and some of their other investigators, actually in an operating room or working with cadavers or doing things that, they probably didn't expect to do, but learning like, what is it really like if they have to use this tool? What are the constraints that they have, even within the space that they're in and the time, and how does that look and feel? So these kind of experiential activities. And also in building, in looking at this type of integration, there was a lot of discussion about having someone who can bridge between different disciplinary groups. The interesting thing to me is that it was often mentioned that postdocs serve this role as bridgers and bridging across these disciplines. And I know this has come up in a couple of the other presentations, so I really feel like we need to talk and write something up about this. So the idea that they were able to train themselves in these other disciplines. They're also working with each other, attending all of them. They're more likely to be the people that are attending meetings across the project, more so than individual investigators. And so they really were serving this role of working in translating information back and forth and providing this connection across the different parts of the team. And then PIs and co-PIs also take on this role by sharing knowledge and coordinating communication. In many ways, this was often the lead PI. When it was working well, many people told me that we couldn't have done this without our PI, because they took on this, sharing of knowledge and coordinating communication across all the groups and keeping everyone connected. And other people recognized maybe there was a particular co-PI who set a particular standard through their own examples. When we look at social integration or some of the teaming aspects, what was really mentioned was building trust and respect and creating shared norms. So some simple things that we're all familiar with, right? Regular and frequent engagement, cultivating relationships, sometimes even doing social and non-science activities. This was not common among all groups, but a couple groups felt that it was really important for them and helping to foster empathy for just the different life stages that people were at and career stages. Retreats and immersive experiences. One of the teams that we worked with, they put everyone on a ship and they were out at sea for a couple days. Some people who had never done that before, and having that immersive experience of working on these things, seeing how different technologies and tools are used in the field in the moment. And then rotating voice, so making sure that everyone is heard on the team, and having different people take leadership roles at different points. So this quote I thought was really important. It reminds me of a lot of what we talk about, right? It's about the individuals as well as fields. They're not just fields, they're individual people with all that brings. They are packages of many things, not just their field, not just their discipline. So we talk a lot about disciplinary integration and how do we integrate the different disciplines. And so this acknowledgement among the teams that, yes, the disciplinary integration is really important, but also this integration of individuals as individual people and human beings. What I call the scientists are human beings too phenomenon. So in asking them in the survey, is that about this operationalization, some basic questions, right? My convergence research project team engaged in the following: regular meetings, of course. Yes, we can't have enough meetings. Cross-disciplinary presentations, yes. Intensive sessions or retreats. A lot of people were involved in intensive sessions or retreats. Collaboration planning, which I was surprised it was a handful of people in that category. Developing a team glossary, mind mapping exercises, and extensive joint field work. So thinking about the going out to sea and other things like that. But mind mapping, collaboration planning, and team glossary were also things that came up in the interviews. So in thinking about how we, thinking about this convergence culture aspect, I felt that this quote really brought together the three aspects of knowledge integration, methodological integration, and social integration. Working towards this idea of convergence. And so I think this would happen naturally in any context, but I think what that meant was real attention to create a culture that would allow people to ask questions, and no question was a silly one. I think maybe it was through the co-PI demonstrating this in the beginning and building a kind of team culture where it was okay to ask those types of questions. And this type of sentiment was prominent in different ways throughout. All right, I said I'd touch briefly on how they're measuring convergence and the success conditions. So I say this is not as exciting because I think it's probably most of what you would expect. Participants largely found this question very difficult to answer as a quantifiable measure. They were struggling very much with it. And because of that, their responses fell into some things we would normally look to, right? Traditional markers of academic success, publications, presentations, successful patent applications, and measuring their career outcomes for their trainees. Typical things also for reporting back to NSF as well. For some of the teams, the impact on policy and stakeholders was a really important measure of success for them, providing useful data to decision makers and stakeholders, impacting policy or affecting change at the policy level, bringing together multiple stakeholders, sort of being that bridge between industry, academia, and communities. So those were measures of success for some of the groups, but not all. And then some of the groups talked about what I would call the emotional and psychological aspects of the experience. So they talked about it being enjoyable. Like this was really hard, but I enjoyed it. You know, one person said, if you told me what this was gonna be like beforehand, I probably would have said no, and I wouldn't have been part of this team. But it's turned out to be very enjoyable and very rewarding. And part of that is because there were this focus on building a stable and functional intellectual community and also these social relationships. So they enjoyed working with each other, they built trust and empathy, and they thought a real measure of success was, building these intellectual communities that will continue to be successful in different ways and have different outputs and outcomes as they go. What was needed to be successful? From the interviews, people talked about really 4 main categories for success conditions. Obviously, resources. Everyone is going to say we need more time, we need more money, and institutional support. Team building came up as well. This really focused on the intentionality of the actions and work that they were doing, fostering trust and building empathy through what is really an intense process for many of these teams, especially the first 2 years of phase 1. And leadership. Leadership came out quite a bit. So people talked about the PIs centering the team needs over individual ones. And the PIs themselves talked about how they took on this role intentionally of being the person to make the space for and to facilitate the collaboration. And in many cases, this meant that, they put aside a lot of their own research and their own work. A couple of the PIs mentioned that they've haven't had a lot of productivity individually since they took on this work. And some of them are changed their whole schedules, taking text messages in the morning because that's when doctors are up, or, spending days at sea or a week at sea with trying to help other people learn what's happening throughout that process without really focusing on what they're getting out of it. So I think that's a really interesting outlook on it. But they all said that also it's been very rewarding and worth it. And then, of course, the individual attributes, we need people that are open and willing to engage outside of their discipline. And I think this leads back a lot to the intellectual curiosity and the epistemic humility. So some final thoughts. What we learned from a lot of these teams is creating a convergence culture requires a significant upfront investment. In looking at the teams that were phase 1 funded and moved to phase 2, and the ones who were just recently awarded phase 2, phase 1 was really cultivating this convergence culture. That's where they spent their time. And most of the teams in phase 2 felt like it was more of a maintenance type of thing at that point, but also onboarding new postdocs and things like that. So I'm also very curious to think about what does it look like long term to look at these projects. What is the cycle? What is this? Is there a cycle to these projects, and what does it look like when you build that over 2 years with one group of people, and that changes over time? Team science competencies and best practices are vital. Values, attitudes, and beliefs are important as individuals. Our habits of mind, the knowledge-based skills we bring, and the interpersonal skills, of course, as we all know. And interview findings illustrate how the team leaders and the teams are being intentional about fostering this convergence culture that emphasizes this relationship building, information transfer through dynamic communication, and cultivating common ground through deep methodological and conceptual integration. And I think that's really important. It highlights the important role of leadership and these bridgers in helping to facilitate that knowledge and methodological integration process. Some thoughts on future work. Definitely further analysis into the data that we collected. Interview data is very rich. And I would like to look more at the teams who were not successful in receiving continued funding to compare to, how they see, what they were doing. Are they doing some of these similar practices and processes, but without similar results? What is the missing link there? What are we missing? I would love to expand the dissemination of the survey to allow for more sophisticated analysis. So, we're looking at a small sample, really just the PIs and co-PIs from the Growing Convergence Research Program, which was limited to just 173 folks or so. So we had a small response to that. So it would be wonderful to look at this in other groups, but also in a larger sample in general. And then the potential for longitudinal data collection to really better understand these changes of conceptualization and operationalization over time. There is a little bit of, a different way that some of the interviewees who were in phase 2 talked about this than phase 1. I'm having a little bit more experience, and they're thinking, some of them, the interview was the first time that they really reflected on what it meant to them. So it's doing more collection, more data points, data collection points over time would be interesting. And then connecting theory to practice. So part of our project is also working on some theoretical development of convergence, and connecting those to the practice is where I'm interested. And I want to leave you with one thought, and then I see lots of things in the chat that I obviously can't keep up with. Which is great. So if team science competencies and best practices are necessary for convergence research, do they create the sufficient conditions for convergence research to be successful, or is there something else? And I will leave it there. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Marisa. That was a really amazing overview of this program that you're supporting, and I think just a great thing for all of us to see the systematic approach to investigating this, creating a culture of convergence, and what people think convergence is, what the success conditions are, and all of that. Thank you so much. So I'm going to open up the floor for comments and questions now, or if you want to respond to Marisa's last question in her presentation. So please feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we will take the next 10 minutes or so to invite questions and discussion. Okay, I'm gonna actually start us off while other people are formulating their questions. So I attended the GCR informational webinar and was really interested in hearing the NSF program officer talking about that program, and then also seeing some examples of the teams that have been successful. And it has occurred to me that the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative has worked with hundreds of teams over the years and have worked in the convergence space and with, the ExcelNet program at NSF. So you've been looking at this from a lot of different angles. And when you were asking in some of these survey questions, how you might evaluate convergence, or how you might evaluate what the success conditions are for convergence. I would be curious if you're comfortable saying, if you step back and sort of consider with all of your experience, I would imagine you have gut feelings at times about whether teams will be successful and whether that team will kind of embrace this convergence culture. So kind of from your perspective, is that something that you feel like you can observe in these teams early on? Or is that kind of the early dynamics, are they not a good indicator of whether teams will be successful later?
I love this question, Amalia, because we do talk about this all the time. And a couple years ago at the Insights Conference, Jaime Garcia Vila and I had a poster session. We were looking at evaluating the dialogue and whether it's a good or average or poor dialogue. And then the reason we were doing that is because we were trying to think of how might that relate to thinking about the team effectiveness or performance. And Rebecca's webinar a couple of weeks ago, she had a dialogue scale too. And so it's something I'm really hoping to dive into again. I do think that, and Chet, you can chime in if you want. I know that we do have some initial thoughts at the beginning. Whether or not that early stage is a good indicator, that's really hard. That's really hard to say. Excuse me. I I think that some, it's possible that some teams, right, could turn it around. And we don't always have every team member present, but I do think one of the things that came out of these interviews is the leadership. And, we're often working with the core leadership and the PI and maybe a co-PI. If so, there's another team we work with where there's PIs at two institutions and they are co-PIs and they are really a team, right, in leading this. And so I think there's some element of leadership there that is really important. That could be an interesting measure or indicator. I do think that how the team communicates with each other is a really early indicator for sure. And that's why I'm looking at this dialogue measure. Like, are they asking questions of each other? Are they curious about what other people think, or are they just making assumptions and moving on to something else? Are they making sure that they hear from everyone on the team? Are they really trying to understand what others are saying? So that is I love that question a lot because it's something I think about a lot, and it's something that I really would love to put a framework and a structure around. And I do think that, the knowledge methodological social integration provides an interesting framework to start with, but looking at the dialogues, we have so many dialogues to go back with. And I know AY's on this call too. She has a lot to say after cleaning the transcripts from many dialogues. There's so many things that we can pick up from there. And we've talked about going back and kind of evaluating those dialogues and then seeing if the teams that we gave a good rating were the teams that got phase 2 funding or not. There's a lot that happens in between. So it's, correlation isn't causation, but there could be something there more that we could build on. And other people are interested in that. I'd love to have those conversations.
Great, thank you. We did have a question about whether the interview guide or survey would be available to be shared for evaluation of other teams.
Yeah, I'll talk with
This is Kimber.
Check and Michael on our team, and we can get back with you. That was Glenda, right? No, or that was someone else. Kim. Okay. Yeah, send me an email, and then the slides. Yeah, I mean the slides obviously will be in the recording, but I can make the slides available in a PDF, so people can email me. I was like, I don't want to put anything on Amalia and Christine's plate. Yeah.
Hey, Caroline.
Hey, I was really struck by what you said, Marissa, about this element where leadership on some of these projects were setting aside their individual work, their personal work, changing their schedules, maybe really overhauling how they approach their work on this kind of project and how it relates to the rest of the body of their academic work. And I guess what I was struck by in that comment was this feeling of how many PIs can afford to do that. And I know that, you know, the problems of reward and recognition in team science, you know, is a longstanding conversation and kind of concern, you know, in this community. But I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about what came up with that information, what concerns you, what seems hopeful and inspiring about this, what maybe calls for a change in how we think about how leadership engages with convergence research. Sorry, this is an underdeveloped question, but I'm just going to chuck it out there and hope that you will make some sense out of my scattered words.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I think it's great, Caroline. I think there are a lot of concerns in thinking about that. There's a couple concerns that came up for me in looking at it through the interviews and talking to people, and that's why I'd hope to get more information even from the surveys. But one thing that I want to look at that I haven't looked at is really going back and looking to see, did the teams who had leaders who were more junior in their career get phase 2 funding or not? Because I do think people who are more senior in their career have that flexibility right past tenure to put aside some of their own research things and focus on this project. One of the teams that we spoke with who did not get phase 2 funding was very critical of the program because, and they were an associate professor, but still earlier in the career. And one of the things they talked about was how difficult it was to support grad students when you have a 2-year funding and then you don't know if you're going to get more funding. And so they spent all their time focusing on getting more funding for the grad students. And to me, from what I understand from the interview, was that was at the expense of doing the things for the project that they needed to do. I think there's other factors that could be to consider. So one was, some of these teams were at multiple institutions. Some of them were all at the same institution. So having distributed leadership in different institutions versus centralized institutional support at one institution, is that a factor? I don't know, but it's an interesting variable that I would like to look at. Another one was whether or not these teams are working with communities or not. So some teams are really some teams are working with stakeholders, they're working with communities, decision makers, policy makers, and their trajectory, I think, looks much different than folks that are really focused on creating a technology for medical use or, a much more kind of closed environment. Obviously, medical use, it does get into industry, but they're focusing on, basic science primarily, and the other outcomes are secondary, where other teams are really focused on the societal impact as a primary goal versus in the basic science as a secondary. So that's one. We had one group that was doing international work that we spoke with, and I think they faced a lot more challenges than other teams. And so the 2-year cycle wasn't enough for them. And some of the teams also that are working with communities, the 2 years in creating that convergence culture, wasn't there. And then, there were a lot of leaders who talked about, this is what I've always been doing, but I just finally found all other people that are doing this, that want to do this and think the same way, and now we can do it together. Or, you know, this is what I've always wanted to do. And so there's an interesting thing too of thinking about the individuals that are drawn to this. You know, is there some predisposition that they're you know, going to be more successful or not? Or yeah, so I think there's a lot of factors like that. In the survey, I collected a lot of demographic information too, like is this your first NSF award, or have you received NSF award before? Have you worked with these people on this team before, and how long? So in some cases, there were 3 co-PIs and they've worked together for 15 or 20 years. And other times the teams were put together for the project. We know, you know, from lots of science work that the team composition matters. And so how long people work together in the relationship obviously is going to influence how fast they can build up this, you know, convergence culture and do their work in 2 years to be able to get phase 2. Yeah, so, you know, I'm thinking about this in terms of GCR. Obviously, there's other people doing convergence research, so there's other factors there, and maybe some of those factors don't matter because they're not on a 2-year timeline. In Convergence Accelerator, they're on an even shorter timeline. So, and I don't know about the science and technology centers and other things, but right, everyone's got to, I'm sure, as we know, everyone's got to show they're making progress in certain ways. So we're all on some sort of timeline.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Marisa Rinkus, for joining us from the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative today and giving us all this excellent information and food for thought. And I'd like to end by letting everyone know that our next session will be on January 14th, and our speaker will be Dr. Lakaya Johnson, Principal Scientist at Sage Bionetworks. And so you'll see the information on that coming onto our website shortly, and then also receive some email communications. And so thank you everyone for joining us for this latest installment of Intentional Integration. How do we know if it's working? Dr. Rinkus has included her email there if anyone would like to, in the chat, if anyone would like to follow up with her directly. And also you can, once again, find the recording for this webinar will come onto our website, intoreachwith1r.org, sometime in the next week or two. And we want to again thank Dr. Gabrielle Bammer for hosting these webinar recordings on her I2S YouTube channel. So thank you everyone for attending, and we will see you next month.